Hi, my name is Bas de Natris and I would like to welcome you to the next webinar in the series on migration that we are hosting together with our colleagues from HeliCloud and AWS. Today we're going to talk about migration readiness. Are you ready to start a migration? And part of that question is also, are you ready to run AWS at scale? We're going to assume that this webinar is particularly of interest to you if you are planning to migrate more and more to the cloud and run AWS at scale, which is different probably from what you're doing today. AWS is a premier business partner and we are helping customers throughout the complete life cycle of cloud, from discovery, the first projects, all the way to doing cost innovation projects, managing cost, finding out where it is, helping to optimize, well-architected reviews, managed services, but also supporting customers with creating migration business plans, migration readiness assessments, actual migration, and making sure everything happens to run applications and workloads on the cloud successfully. You are attending today a webinar on migration, so I'm going to make a few assumptions about you. And we all know making assumptions is always a risk, but we're going to do it anyway. I'm going to assume that today you are already running some workloads on the cloud. Typically there will be new projects, often related to innovation. Typical first workloads are web applications or workloads to do with AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning. Your innovation team might be using cloud because those are typical workloads where cloud basically has no competition. You cannot deliver services that fast, that easy on-prem, or for example for web application you'll never have the scalability of cloud in your own environment. You're now considering migrating workloads. Workloads that were never designed for the cloud, workloads that were designed for on-prem, that were designed for on-prem management processes. On-prem could also be a colo, or applications that currently reside with an outsourcer. I'm going to assume that you also attended our first webinar and maybe also the second webinar by HeliCloud, and you are prepared, you have a positive business case, and you know that this is a major program and that requires a program management to get through it successfully. We're not talking about migrating 2 or 3 workloads. We're talking about a sizable set of applications. Sizable because of their absolute size, or sizable because they are the majority of the workloads that you have in your company, and therefore failure is not an option and the benefits are terribly important for you to have. You want to make this a success. You want that migration to deliver in line with the business case and your other expectations. If that's the case, you are at the right webinar. And by the way, the chat or question channels are already open. An AWS solution architect is ready to answer questions, and if they're particular to Oblivion Cloud Control, then we'll take them at the end, and also we'll make sure that at the end of this webinar there's ample time for any other questions. But you can ask them right away. The lines are open, and you'll probably get an answer much earlier than otherwise. So what is a migration assessment? Well, we've been piggybacking with this program from a lot of intellectual capital developed by AWS. AWS has migrated or supported customers with migration to the cloud over the past years. I think this really started to become a trend 5 or 6 years ago, and 4 years ago AWS started releasing and since then updating a lot of methods, methodologies and tools to help customers migrate to the cloud. The migration readiness will look at your organization, your tools, your technology, but also your people, your processes, around 6 domains, and they're basically the 6 domains that are also part, if you are familiar with that, of the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework. If you're not familiar with that, you can find it on the AWS website. It's good to look at it because a successful cloud transformation is so much more than just adopting to the new technology. And a successful cloud migration will involve also a lot of other aspects than just the technology part. On the business side, value realization, and if you attended my previous webinar on business cases, you know that is a big thing. We're not just talking about reaching a lower TCO. It's much more than that. And to do that, will play a role in how you successfully do the migration, and also therefore the migration assessment. We'll be looking at people, we'll be looking at governance, and then we also look, don't worry, we will also look at the platform, the technology, the security, the operations. It's typically done as a one-day workshop, although nowadays with COVID, with working remote, with some customers where we cannot do it face-to-face, we'll typically split it over 2, sometimes 3 sessions. With a lot of stakeholders, this is not just the cloud guys who can do this, because a successful cloud migration involves a lot of stakeholders, involves a lot of people. You need their involvement, their cooperation, their support. Otherwise, you better stop early. The MRA will identify gaps, and those are gaps that you either need to address very early on or gaps that you need to address later on. We're not going to do a full migration readiness assessment on this call. That would take too much time. But we're going to talk about a little bit why you need to involve those other people, what is the specific scope, and give you some examples why you need to do that. If you look at a typical cloud migration, companies will start out with a project, and one successful project typically leads to another project and a third project, and at some stage you decide to build a foundation. You're not going to look at how to implement AWS per individual project. You want to reach the level of standards. You want to make sure that if a new project comes along, a new team comes along, they already benefit from all the lessons learned, from all the security that's been set up, all the compliance tools have been set up, the logging, the monitoring. So you want to build a standardized, what we always call a landing zone. Other people call it a foundation. That will speed up deployment, that will speed up development, but at the same time will also make sure that new cloud projects don't create high risks, that they don't create high cost, and that's a very good practice. And what you see is more and more developers learn to develop cloud native, and that will lead to a reinvention of your applications and hopefully also probably also of your business model. Now, migration is a little bit different, because migration is about migrating applications that were not designed for cloud, that were not designed for the tooling, that were not designed for the processes. Your foundation may not match the need of your migration. So again, you'll need to look at your foundation, your platform. Does that meet the needs of those applications that I'm going to migrate? Where does it fit? Well, it fits in a phase where you've done your business case, and by the way, that business case you're gonna continue updating it along the way. But you have a business case, you have buy-in of people that you want to do this transformational migration. This is not we're gonna migrate from one technical platform to another. It is much more than that. The MRA we recommend to do pretty early on. And sometimes even do a repeat later on, or at least track where do you stand with regard to the gaps that you have identified. And the MRA will lead into the migration planning, followed by the actual migration, typically in multiple waves, and then you have to cut over and you start running on the cloud. Back to benefits. When we did the previous conference call, the previous webinar on business cases, I talked about that a lot of companies leverage cloud, want to go to cloud, primarily or mainly because it brings them business agility, speed of operations that they will not have on any other platform. A second very good reason, obviously, is around operational resilience, the setup, especially of AWS, of regions with multiple availability zones, with lots of tools and processes in place to make sure that if something breaks, and listening to Werner Vogels, he's always saying, things break all the time, and AWS is prepared for that. And if you prepare for that, you can reach an incredible good resilience. You inherit a lot of regulatory compliance, certifications and attestations. So there's a lot of things on the left side of this slide that are often the typical reasons why a company wants to migrate to cloud. Those reasons may not apply to all in-scope applications that you want to migrate. For some, it might just be, well, cost avoidance, investment capex avoidance, reduction of operational cost, and that's fine. But for the group of applications that you're going to migrate, you need to know where do they fit, what kind of benefits are expected. If it's only on the right side, or if there's, at least for parts of that portfolio of applications, a lot of emphasis on the left side, that will drive what you need to do and how you're going to migrate. And I don't mean if business agility is the main reason that cost doesn't play a role. Cost will always play a role. But you may make different choices than if cost is the primary driver. So make sure, and you already should have done this in your business case, so you have addressed what are the reasons, you've documented these, and they'll be an important input when you start looking at your migration readiness. You should also think and talk with your stakeholders. When are we going to call this project, this migration program, a success? The most simplistic one that I often hear is, well, if we've migrated every application. Well, yeah, that's simplistic, because that just states the immediate goal of the migration project. We're going to migrate, we're going to do it. But much more importantly, you also need to figure out, have I addressed the expected benefits? Migrating is one thing. If I migrated because I expected a higher uptime, well, then just migrating a workload that then lands on AWS and runs on a single EC2 instance in a single AZ, that is not going to help you at all. It's migrated, but it hasn't reached the benefit. So if those benefits are important, you need to factor them into the migration, or you need to be very explicit that they're not part of the migration, but then you are required to set up a follow-on projects to deal with those. So document them, make clear which benefits are, the realization of which benefits is part of your project and which are not, and where the focus is. If you do a goodMRA, then you'll get, and we do quite a few of them, and I've done also some in the past when I was still working for AWS. A goodMRA gives you a good point in time picture of where you stand with regards to cloud maturity across those 6 elements of the cloud adoption framework. It will also give you a view of where am I lacking in terms of maturity for this particular migration. And it will also tell you which are the ones that you need to fix early or start fixing early, because they really should be done before you go into the next phase, the planning phase, or which ones are fine. You're not where you need to be, but it's okay if you're not going to be there during the planning and maybe even during the initial migration activities, as long as you've done it by the time your applications start landing on AWS. It is important that you also answer the questions with that point in time view. It doesn't make sense to answer yes, because I know we have a project underway and a year from now we're going to have it. If you are pretty certain that you're going to have it, you're implementing, I don't know, a new management tool or a new process, and the project is underway, there's an owner who's committed, who's got a budget, who's got a team, yeah, of course, then it's good to say, well, no, we're not there now, and we have everything in place to get there on time. That's a good answer. Saying, no, we're not there, but I'm sure we're going to be there on time, when you haven't found the initiative owner, when you haven't addressed the budget, that's bad practice. Aside from having this point in time picture and the recommendations, you will also have had, and that assumes that you had the right stakeholders at the table, some very valuable discussions that will lead to an improved alignment across the various stakeholders in your organization. Extremely important. You've probably uncovered potential blockers and conflicts that you were not aware. Conflicting priorities within business lines, conflicting projects with other parts of your organization. You've created alignment in your organization, you flagged where you have issues, and also on the positive side, and what I've seen often, you probably also discovered some best practices or some people who are really knowledgeable, some experience, some tools. Maybe somebody developed some cost management dashboards where you think, hey, we can roll them out to other parts of our organization, and it will really help in further cloud adoption and also for this migration. So it's not just the result, the process of getting to that result will be very valuable as well. So who do you need to have in your migration readiness assessment workshop, that 6-7 hour thing, or that if we're going to split it over 2 or 3 sessions? Well, ideally, you have these people. You have the business leader that has the most to gain from this migration. You have your chief architect who understands how this all fits into your overall enterprise architect. the CIO, but you also have somebody from finance who understand how do we account for, how do we budget for IT costs today, how we're going to do that in the future with cloud. Security, network, application development, infrastructure, operations, and maybe the application owners of the first applications that are going to be in scope. Now maybe especially some of the more senior people, but also some of the specialists may not want to attend or may not be able to attend the full MRA. Well, that's not a big problem, but it's also not good if they only attend the handful of questions that deal with their particular part of the process. Because if you want to get the alignment, if you want to discover the hidden blockers and hidden issues, it's good to have people attending the parts that are adjacent to their own part. So preferably all people attend most of it. If they can only attend part of it, try to get them to at least attend more than just their own part, so they can hear what other parts of your organization think, do, and see where they can contribute. When we start an MRA, we typically start on the business side. So you get questions about applications that are in scope. What are the expected outcomes? Do you have a signed up business case? Do you have a good stakeholder plan? So all the stakeholders aligned to that. So a lot of proper program management questions that any program manager will start with whenever he engages with a new program or a new project, because they're so important for the success. So we'll start with those as well. And from there on, we'll dive into governance. We'll look at your IT organization setup, but also how do you do it today for cloud? Back to my assumption, you already have some stuff running on the cloud. You have some organization around that, some processes, well, that may not fit running a much larger workload volume on AWS. It may not fit managing applications that weren't designed for cloud in the first place. The questions sometimes are unpleasant because they discover, and they are designed to discover, areas where you're not as mature as you want to be. You're not as mature as you should be. And I remember an MRA I was part of about 2 years ago, where the head of IT operations, who was standing in as the CTO as well, with the first question, and I was there with a colleague, we were doing the MRA together. It was going to be a full day session. We had the right people at the table, fairly large group, about 12 people. And we asked our first question, and he was clearly the most senior manager in the room, and he immediately starts, we definitely score a 5. It's a pity that you don't have a 6 on the scale. He was making a joke out of it, but we definitely score a 5. We're really good at this. And I'm looking at my colleague, and we're thinking, oh my God, this is going to be a hard day, because he's clearly a very dominant person, and he's going to see this all as a personal scorecard. So he wants to be able to have a straight report with 5s across the board, because it reflects on the quality of his work, and so we didn't want to fight that, but we started asking questions. And eventually said, and trying to qualify, well, if you are a 5, you really have this and that in place. And then he had to acknowledge, well, maybe not, maybe it's a 4. And we asked a few more questions, and he had to say, okay, well, well, maybe a 3.5. And then we were pretty brutal to say, fine, but we don't have any interim figures. We only have whole numbers. So if it's a 3.5 in your view, then we always round down, it's a 3. Thank you. Next question. After a while, he started opening up, and he started understanding we were not there to look at the quality of his work. It's normal, if you don't run cloud at scale, that you don't have all these processes, tools, people, etc. in place. It would be a waste, in fact, to have that in place when you actually don't need it yet. And after a while, he started to understand. He said, well, the scoring isn't important. Well, it is. But in a way, the discussion to get to the score is the real important stuff. And he started to understand, and that's where he also started having his people answer more of the questions rather than taking the personal lead. So doing this, a successful MRA will need to have an experienced facilitator who can help mitigate maybe a very powerful, dominant person in the room who may see this initially as a personal threat. It also helps if you do some good preparation and explain to some people like that how it's going to work and where they can help making it a successful MRA. And a successful MRA is not a report score with straight 5s across the board. 5 is the highest score in the MRA methodology. That actually would be an non-credible outcome, and that serves no purpose. So we're going to continue. We've talked about scope, goal, stakeholder buy-in. Back to my business case, favorite topic. We're going to go into AWS cost management. AWS cost management is interesting because especially if you are today in a company where you use AWS in a rather limited way, you can be surprised, and most companies I talk to are delighted how incredibly low cost AWS is. When you talk about, you look at their spend, sometimes we are a little bit nasty and we look at the effectiveness of their spend. You say, hey, we can take 30% of your bill if you are a little bit more efficient. And sometimes you get the answer, well, who cares? This is pocket change. We don't care about paying 30% too much because it's still, the costs are irrelevant on our total IT budget. Well, that's good. That's normal. However, now you're going to drive a lot of applications to the cloud, so volumes increase, and that will be more EC2, more EBS, more data transfer, more logging. Suddenly, on a lot of areas, a lot of cost drivers start running, and if you're not prepared for that, you're going to get that surprising AWS invoice, and you have that cloud bill shock where you think, oh my God, what has happened? Where does this cost come from? Well, yeah, from your migrated workloads. But exactly how can I charge this out? How can I manage this better? And if you're running after the facts, well, then you're going to be in for a nasty month because you're going to find that out without good monitoring when you receive the bill. That means that month is already over, the damage is done, and the next month is already running. And even if you can be very quick, that next month will still be a very high invoice. So you need to start thinking before you hit that volume, how do I manage that? Sometimes, yeah, the bill will go up, and therefore you need to be prepared. You need to have factored that in. But you also need to do a lot of work in making sure that that bill is under control, it's optimal, and you have the processes and tools in place to manage that properly. Because typically your business case will have a number of assumptions around AWS optimization. You'll have looked at optimizing instance sizes, you will have looked at switching of workloads, you will have looked at deploying things in an optimal way. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen automatically. If people just start switching on instances, not being very diligent in right sizing, not switching off a development environment, then your reality is going to be very different in a negative way compared to your business case. So you need to build in that cost awareness, and cost awareness is partially having somebody who looks at the cost and gets the reports and pulls down the report, but also allocate it to the right place, making sure that those people who influence the cost because they make choices on the platform are aware of what they're doing and are aware that every action they take, every API call they make costs money. You need to have somebody who are looking, do I get sufficient performance out of my AWS spend? How do I benchmark? Somebody who looks at cost optimization. You can't expect a developer to think about, oh, I'm going to launch a new workload that should be on a 3-year RI or it should be part of a savings plan. He may have relevant input, but somebody needs to be responsible who understands what is happening and understands what's coming down the line and understand AWS cost drivers and AWS savings plans and discount plans and what have you. They're not easily found, so quite often it means training of somebody in your organization. Managing cost on cloud is very different from managing cost in an on-prem situation. It's even very different from managing cost with an outsourcer. Cost with an outsourcer at least has a lot more visibility, and you have but the process is there typically around the request for service that you issue, that gets approved internally, and then you send it to the outsourcer who will say, okay, well fine, this will cost X, do you approve? Here, somebody makes an API call and you'll see the consequences of that, the outcomes of that as a line item in your next invoice. So you need to adapt your processes and you need to have thought that through before applications start landing on the platform and the AWS cost bill goes up. Fun topic and becoming more and more important in lately as people run more stuff on AWS, and that incredibly low invoice of the first workloads is no longer so fun and no longer so low. Another thing we sometimes run into is, are you okay with all the contracts? Did your legal team, your procurement, your data privacy officer look at what are you going to deploy on the cloud, and are they okay with all the measurements you've taken? For example, things to deal with GDPR or data privacy, or in Dutch the AVG, are partially a contractual thing, and typically AWS has done that already correctly and added the right contract text to your contract automatically. But you also need to take certain actions, and running things that were in your own data center and are now running with AWS, you need to make sure you've documented it right and you have a data processing agreement set up with AWS. It's part of your standard agreement, but your data privacy officer need to have access on that, need to have reviewed it and understand it and be comfortable with it. In some cases, I worked with customers where we found out there were no legal restrictions to start using AWS and store data and process data on a platform outside of the Netherlands. But they had agreements with business partner that data would never leave the country. Well, that is a problem. You don't want to find that out halfway your project, and forbid you don't want to find it out after you've migrated. You want to know that in advance and work with that partner or work with that customer and tell them why you want to do this, what are the benefits, and why is this still a very in control process, and data that resides on the cloud is as safe, if not safer, than it used to be. But you need to do it early. So you need to validate in your assessment, have we done all of that? If not, when are we going to do this? I've also had legal and procurement saying, well, hang on, yes, we approved AWS, but our approval was really only valid for these few first initial innovation workloads. We never looked at AWS in light of running most of our workloads and having most of our corporate data on AWS. Again, it can be fixed because typically, but it's again a process that they need to go through and start becoming familiar and comfortable with having a changed role for this platform. If you are in a regulated industry, you may need to have third-party risk assessment or third-party reviews on how you're going to run this on AWS. Obviously, some parts of the MRA are quite technical, so people who really understand how it's been set up need to be there. So we can talk about the landing zone, guardrails. Does it cover all future services? Is security okay with it? We're going to look at operations. We have companies that say, oh yeah, but when things land on cloud, it's all going to be in DevOps. So the development team will also be operations. You build it, you run it, and that's great. That is a best practice, and you see companies do that very successfully. However, it does require a certain DevOps maturity of your teams. It does require DevOps maturity of your processes, and that is not just the development process, but a lot of the supporting processes as well, including financial processes. And combining all of that with the cloud migration can in some cases be done, but sometimes it becomes too much of a change. So again, we're going to run through that initially, and we're going to discuss whether you're ready to do that. If you're not going to go for DevOps, but your ops people will remain the first port of call if something goes wrong, fine. Are they set up to do this with AWS? Are they set up to do this with AWS at scale? Are they trained on that? Do they have the right tooling? Or are you relying on your existing tooling that you use today for your data center? Have you tested if that can deal with the incredible amount of logging data that comes out of the cloud? Or do we need to build any filters, or do you need to migrate to new tooling that's much more cloud native? So a lot of things that we need to review and discuss and look at. Part of the team that you want to have in the MRA, because they also play a role in the Cloud Competence Center, is in the migration, is your Cloud Competence Center. We see some companies now going to something they call the Cloud Business Office, where you have a team that looks more at the company's business, at the strategy, the future, and make sure that the cloud enterprise architecture, the governance, the training and readiness, finance, change management is all aligned to the applications, and those applications where they focus on which really differentiate us as a company, which are things we need to have, and which is really commodity. You also have your cloud engineering, obviously, the guys who run to the platform, who know AWS to an incredible depth and can support development team and can do that deep level of operations, maintaining of the landing zone, etc. Again here, what are you expecting to get out of cloud? What kind of benefits? That determines the priorities for these people. They need to be there, and again, you need to test, is my Cloud Competence Center, or whatever name you put on it, are they set up to deal with the much higher volume and also the different kind of applications that you're going to run on cloud? If they're not, then who's going to do it? Are you going to expand your Cloud Competence Center, or are you going to put that responsibility with somebody else? Important to know. So you basically look at a migration roadmap across your landing zone, your governance operations, security compliance. Well, you can see what's all there. We'll look at the input. We'll talk it through and figure out in a report where do you stand. And the first output of an MRA looks like this, a nice radar screen that at least gives you where do you stand. And this is one from an actual migration that I worked on, a fairly large company. And you see the best where they score this is a balanced score around all the questions in that particular domain. They're sort of at the 50% mark in most, in governance a little bit ahead, quite a traditional company, very formalized governance, but most likely to a large extent appropriate. But you can imagine if this is what you score, and again, this is not an overall bad result, this is quite okay, you're going to have quite a few action points, but at least this focuses you immediately, where do I need to look? And for example, on there, in this particular case, from their staff, both development as well as IT operations, there were very few people still who had exposure to cloud. They were using cloud, they were using cloud quite successfully, but in a few isolated pockets, in areas where it really made a difference, web applications required scalability, applications that were developed together with external partners. Those people had all the skill, or had a lot of skills and experience. The rest was much more traditional setup and had very little exposure yet to the cloud. So then you need to do, you know where you need to tackle, and you need to start working. Sample output, so you get that radar screen and you get a whole report with it. But this is another sample output page from the report that will tell you, okay, what are things I need to address, and marked in the typical red, amber, and green. And aside from that gives you the relative importance. For example, organizational training is red because you need to fix that, but for the large part you don't need to fix that immediately, and that is the little box in front of it that indicates, well, this is something you need to address actually ideally before you go into your planning phase. At least have your improvement plans in place, budgeted, approved before you go into the planning phase, because if you have insufficient project management capabilities, you have not specific migration workloads committed, workload owners buy-in or alignment isn't there, well, better take some time now to fix that before you start investing more and potentially go off track. The fact that your developers and your operations people are not completely trained and practiced and experienced with AWS, that's okay. In fact, you may want to deliver that shortly before applications start landing. Because if people learn it now and then don't have anything to do with AWS in the coming 6 months because their particular applications are in a second wave or a third wave, well, that's a waste. By that time they may have forgotten, or even worse, they loved working with cloud. They did the course, they did the training, they got some hands-on experience, they liked it, and then they find out, oh, well, it's going to take another year before I'm actually working with this wonderful new technology. They may start looking for another job. So you want to deliver training sort of just in time. Again, that probably means that you need to start early, because a lot of companies nowadays do these trainings with limited class roll, and especially in these COVID times, you may want to cut back on classroom even more. But there's a lot of self-service options on the market. Cloud Guru, Cloud Academy. There's a whole bunch of online trainers where you can buy a license or tell people you can sign up yourself and expense it, and people can follow trainings. And a lot of those trainings are pretty good. I've seen companies use that, leverage that to really improve the cloud awareness, cloud skills of their teams. But again, depending on your company, it may not happen very rapidly. Just telling people, well, here it is not going to work. It may work for a few early adopters, but there's a lot of people who are not going to do those trainings unless somebody pushes them, pulls them. So it's not just enough to sign up for the contract so they can do the training. You also need to track it. You need to celebrate the first people who pass a certificate, who pass a training, or pass, even better, a certification exam. Celebrate that. Give the right example. So you want to make sure that people understand that it is their responsibility to be trained up by the time their application lands, but they also get the facilities to do so. But at the same time, it's not just sit on your ass and we'll bring it to you. No, they need to know that. Depends on your company, but this is something you don't need to fix early on, but you need to have the programs in place because this takes time. So the next phase, after you've done all this, you are going to go into migration planning, because you know what needs to be done. You need to know who's going to do it, who's going to own it. You have a plan for learning. Learning, I mean, not just the learning we just discussed for your staff, but also learning in part of the migration, because you're going to schedule all these waves. You have all these plans available, and then you're going to do your first wave, and you're going to find out that things are not exactly as you envisaged. They're slightly different. So once you do that, you find out what was different, how do we fix it, was it a proper fix, and you factor that into the next wave. So even although you're going to build a plan in the next phase, that plan, as always, need to be flexible on the details, but focused on the outcome. Your MRA will deliver your point-in-time picture. It will also tell you what do you need to improve by when, so you can factor that into the planning. And if you did it right, you'll have to buy in from your stakeholders, but also your stakeholders, especially the senior ones, understand very well that this is not just a technology program. Doing a good cloud transformation and doing a successful migration involves a lot more, and you're only going to be successful if those stakeholders and sponsors understand that and are ready to stand up and defend the needs of your program. I've had one where after the MRA, we basically concluded that there was not enough buy-in from the business. The business made clear, oh yeah, we love you to do this cloud migration because we understand we get a higher availability, we get a lower price, we have lower capex. We love all that. That's great, wonderful. Why don't you go and do it? We said, well, yeah, but we can only do it if we get these and these involvements of the business owners, and even a very minimum. We need people to do a test once it landed on the cloud, and some things may change, and some things may not work so well in the interim, and some application. And it was clear the business was not. They were willing in the end, very interested in the end result. They were not willing to put on the table what their involvement needed to be, and at that point, that customer decided to call it off. And actually, the real root cause was their business case was not good enough. Their business case had been focused too much on cost avoidance and operational savings, and they had not sold to the business, not made clear what the real impact on the business potentially could be. So that was back to the drawing board, back to the business case, and there's some tools for that where you help your business understand what the positive impact of cloud can be for their business. And that changed, and well, but it took about a 6 to 8 months delay before we were back at the space and could begin the migration. So it's time for questions. So we'll open it up for that. Just a short reminder, tomorrow there's another 2 webinars. If you haven't signed up for them yet, there's still a possibility to do so. They're not with us, they're with our colleagues from Healy Cloud. As said, we have some time for questions still on this call, and if you don't want to ask your question on the call here, or you want to discuss your migration project or any other cloud project or issue that you're dealing with, you can reach out to me at my email. Well, that was a bit of an abrupt ending. Thank you for the prepared remarks, as I think we call those. We have still quite some time for questions and answers. One question that came through that I wanted to tackle first, and then we'll open the floor for any other questions. Is there was one question saying, well, this sounds really like something for a very large enterprise and doesn't really apply to a smaller company. And at the extremes, you might say, yes, if you work for a small tech startup where almost everybody in your company understands cloud computing, understands technology very well, well, no, you don't need this. But then again, you probably don't have much of a migration. You probably either are already all in on the cloud, or you are already halfway the process, and maybe this is not a process for you. In some of my experience that I shared, that was indeed based on experience with quite large enterprises. However, it still applies to sort of medium-sized companies where you're going to have to do a lot of things that will impact also the people and a part of the management and a part of the leadership that are not very tech savvy, they may know about cloud, they may know about Amazon, but they don't understand all the consequences. Obviously, in a large enterprise, a lot more politics and programs and projects and conflicts and issues play a role. But in a smaller one, you want to do this as well. If you remember the slide I showed you with the list of attendees in a smaller company, probably there's a lot of double roles. You're not going to have for every role a separate individual, but that's fine. At least as you have people who can cover those tracks at the table. So hopefully that will clarify it. We have a few others. A learning track for leading and managing the migration readiness assessment as a migration project manager. I don't think there is. I've done, as said, I've done a few. I typically do them together with a colleague. Because you'll have 2 things to do. One is you moderate, you facilitate, and that sometimes can be quite a handful. At the same time, sometimes you want to participate in a discussion and ask the follow-on questions to test whether an answer you're going to get is really the full answer. And at the same time, you need to track the answers. There's a tool where you track your online answers. So with 2 people, you already have a pretty. It's hard work. You're tired afterwards, but it's worth it. I don't know of any training. Run through the questions yourself. You can find at least as an AWS partner, we have access to the tool and can run through it ourselves. And have some experience with facilitation of these kinds of workshops. So sorry, no formal course that I know of.
Best practices for MRA, again, is have the right people at the table, have them prepared. It doesn't mean that they need to do a lot of research or homework, but they need to be prepared to understand what programs are running in their part of the business. You don't want to have an MRA where you have a lot of things. Well, I need to get back to you on that. You want to have answers on the spot, because you're not going to have the time. It's slightly over 70 questions. You also want to turn it around into an answer a few days later, and if you're going to allow a lot of people to come back with answers later, then that will just muddy up the process, because that answer is then not shared with the whole team. That doesn't really work well. Then what role typically of leading the MRA? Ideally, it could be the designated program manager. That is an option, because he definitely has a vested interest in getting every issue and potential conflict and misalignment or lack of alignment or lack of buy-in surfaced at the table. If possible, I would prefer to have somebody a little bit neutral. We made an offer, and up to you to follow on. Together with AWS and HeliCloud, we have an offer that if you attended the majority of the webinars, you can apply to us for us leading an MRA. We can support a few. We're kind of busy right now, but we can support a few. We would do that free of charge. Now, that we're going to assess whether it fits, whether it's worth our time, whether it's worth your time. But we have the option for a couple of companies, a couple of attendees to facilitate a workshop like that. So we would do the MRA with you, and we would present you with the outcomes. So that's an option. If you do an MRA in-house, yeah, as I said, have the right stakeholders at the table, the person doing it, and as I said, it should be really two-person. You can't do this by yourself, because then you quite often need to ask, well, hang on, let me document this before we continue, which means you'll either it becomes too lengthy, or you're going to miss discussions that happen while you are busy documenting. So at least two people, both who can sort of take over from each other, because continuously leading this process is probably too much. You need to sort of, now I'll document the next chapter and you facilitate, and the other way around. I hope that answered the question a little bit. Any other question? You can obviously enter your question in the question box. I think you can raise your hand, and I can then unmute you if that's what you want to do. Don't see any other question coming in right now, so think about it. Take there's some time left if you want to do that. As said, small companies, large companies, I recommend, if you are going to do a migration, to run through this. If you think you don't need it, well, then probably you can run through it pretty quickly, because you have the answers, there's no conflicts, there's alignment, and you'll run through this within a couple of hours. Then it's a good confirmation, and you wouldn't be the first to discover, we thought we were ready and we're not. And then the outcome with all the action items that you need to fix, and do I need to fix them before going into the next phase, or is just another track in my whole migration planning, is extremely valuable to have. I've seen quite a few cloud migrations that either failed, meaning they stopped halfway, in my definition, or were successful in as far as they migrated the applications to the cloud, but did not deliver according to the expectations. And that's just a waste. That's sad. There's no need for that. We're never going to reach 100% success. But there's enough tools, and this is an important tool to help you prevent that. So use it. Reach out to us if you think we can help you making a success out of your migration, or assess whether you're actually ready. If you want to do the migration yourself, we can just be that objective party that can help you assess, are you ready to go into the next phase where you start spending more money, and ending halfway with half of your applications on the cloud and half not, is also not an ideal place to be. So use it to your advantage. Okay, I don't see any other question. So if there's none, then I would like to thank you very much for your attendance. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you're going to use it. And let me know what you thought about it, and definitely let us know if we can help you. All right, and last reminder, there's 2 more webinars as part of this series tomorrow. If you can find the time, really useful to attend those and learn from that. All right, thanks very much and have a great day. Goodbye.